Hi, I'm Keon, a research analyst with Lipper, and I'm here to speak to you about fund flows for the week ended Wednesday, October 1st. Let's start by taking a look at last week's market activity. The U.S. broad market indices both suffered significant losses last week. The S&P 500 was down 2.6%, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average was off 2.4%. Both of the indices suffered all their losses during the first and last trading sessions of the week. The announcement that Bill Gross would be leaving PIMCO, the firm he helped co-found over 40 years ago, for Janus Capital Group dominated the week's news. Gross will be taking over the Janus Unconstrained Bond Fund at Janus. This fund is newly launched in May of this year and has just $13 million in assets under management. The announcement that Gross will be leaving puts an end to a turbulent last chapter of Gross's career at PIMCO. During this time frame, Gross has seen his flagship PIMCO Total Return Fund suffer 17th consecutive monthly net outflows, while also his heir apparent abruptly resigned from the firm, and he's been accused of somewhat erratic behavior during this time period. Turning back to the PIMCO Total Return Fund, as we said, it has suffered 17 consecutive monthly net outflows. This totals over $90 billion in net outflows, including $23.5 billion in September of this year. The $23.5 billion is by far the largest monthly net outflow for the fund. PIMCO has confirmed that the majority of the outflows occurred on the day that it was announced that Gross would be leaving. We'll talk about where we see these outflows flowing to later on in our discussion here. Segueing over to the overall flows for the market this week, aggregating both mutual funds and ETFs, we see that there's been positive net flows of $10.3 billion for the week. Let's take a closer look at our macro groups now. Equity funds suffered outflows of $3.8 billion last week, their second consecutive week of outflows. Taxable bond funds took in $2.7 billion, their eighth consecutive week of inflows. Muni bond funds had $158 million in positive flows, also their eighth consecutive week, while money market funds took in $18.9 billion. This is their seventh week out of 9 of positive net flows. And as stated earlier, from what we've seen from the data we have available to us so far, it appears that the majority of the outflows from the PIMCO Total Return Fund are being parked in money markets for the time being, while the investors seek a permanent new home for their assets. Let's take a closer look at equity funds now. As stated previously, they had $3.8 billion in net outflows last week. Again, for the second consecutive week, we've seen a fair amount of outflows from non-domestic equity funds. This reverses the trend that we've been seeing most of the year, where they've had strong inflows. This week, they had net outflows of $1.7 billion. This was led by the funds in the International Large Cap Growth Fund category. In one fund in specific, the Thornburg International Value Fund, experienced outflows of over $1.5 billion last week. Let's move on to our equity ETF categories now. The equity ETFs had net outflows of $6.6 billion last week, led by some of the prominent players in the group. The Spider S&P 500 ETF had outflows of $2.9 billion, followed by PowerShares QQQ, which saw $2.1 billion leave, and then finally the iShares Russell 2000 ETF had $1.2 billion leave. Let's move on to our taxable bond fund category now. As stated earlier, they had $2.7 billion in net inflows last week, their eighth consecutive week. Again, one of the stronger groups has been the investment-grade bond fund category, and they took in most of the inflows last week with $4.1 billion. Within this group, we've seen some of the PIMCO Total Return Fund peers benefit from the announcement that Gross would be leaving. The MetWest Total Return Fund took in $1.2 billion, while the Double Line Total Return Fund took in $647 million. On the sell side, we saw investors leaving high-yield funds as they had $2.2 billion in net outflows. Moving on to taxable bond ETFs, This group also experienced outflows. They had 1.1 billion leave for the week. Of note, the PIMCO Total Return ETF saw 650 million in net outflows. This was the second largest in outflows amongst the group. Moving on to our muni bond fund category, the slow but steady continued here. They had 158 million in net inflows. Their eighth straight week of inflows. National munis continued their strong performance again as they led the way with 213 million in net inflows for the week. Moving on to our last topic now, money market funds. As stated earlier, a strong week for them, 18.9 billion, about twice what they took in last week of 9.5 billion. And as we said, we suspect most of this, or a significant amount of this, is related to the outflows from the PIMCO Total Return Fund and investors parking their money here until they have a chance to do a little bit more research and decide to where they permanently want to move the money. Well, that wraps up this week's report. Please join us again here next week, where another analyst will be speaking about the week's fund flows activity. If you'd like to take a deeper dive, please join us at our website at www.lipperusfundflows.com.